We try different
You get to
outfits.
see two of me, how wonderful. That's, sorry. I'm just gonna keep going if you guys are okay with that.
On my email, that can still control settings.
Tonight I want to talk about the links between our need as a society for long-term pain management, societal expectations for that pain management. Think a little bit about our ancestors and the daily pain that they put up with. Last weekend I had the interesting experience of using a old 1940s corn planter to plant corn out in rural North Dakota. And that piece of equipment had started out as a horse-drawn implement. And so it was all cast iron, and like you can see in the picture there, like no safety features on any of the wheels or sprockets. And I'm sitting on this thing and I'm getting pulled by an ATV, and if I move my foot or if I move my feet an inch or two either way, there are sprockets on either side that are turning. So like, think of our ancestors and the lack of safety features and just the hard physical labor that they had to put up with and the toll that takes on their bodies, right? And so they had far different daily expectations of dealing with pain than we do nowadays. Because what's our first answer nowadays? We want a pill, right? We want a pill to fix everything, right? Just a simple little pill. We don't want to, I'm guilty of this myself, we don't want to do the hard work that it takes to stay healthy, or if we're injured, to get back healthy. I personally have a bad shoulder, and for many years I just wanted to go in and get the shot, right? That cortisone shot that made everything all better. Well, it wasn't fixing anything. It wasn't until I actually started to do the awful rehab that you're supposed to do that my shoulder actually got better, and I really don't need that shot anymore. But I didn't want to go through the hard work myself. I wanted to do the easy fix, right? Well, that's kind of where we are as a society and with our expectations. Our expectations led to this huge blow up, and I'm going to show you the stats in a little bit here, of doctors and the medical profession over prescribing prescription drugs, prescription painkillers. And I'm not blaming doctors individually. I've already told you this is a societal problem, right? We are part of the problem. But it's doctors, and it's a healthcare system, and it's the way the healthcare system was set up. Doctors don't want patients to leave their emergency rooms unhappy, right? Because then they get bad evals and all kinds of bad stuff happens. Well, if we go to the emergency room and we're expecting help for our pain, and the doctor says, well, you might have to do some rehab and do it the hard way, we don't like to hear that. Most of us don't like to hear that, right? We'd rather get that simple prescription for hydrocodone and go from there. So that's the relationship with the prescriptions, which lead to addiction and which lead to heroin and fentanyl epidemic that we are currently in, not just Bismarck mandated, but nationwide. We were kind of on the tail end of things. I mean, you could see it coming all across the country, and it finally hit us, and we are in the middle of it right now as far as fatalities. I'm going to kind of skip over the military and addiction part, but you can imagine how this problem has skyrocketed with veterans, especially coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with all kinds of wounds. Of course they want relief from their pain. Of course they do. You can see here, this is a nationwide stats for prescription painkiller, for prescriptions. But you can also see where heroin started to spike in 2010. Our heroin started to spike about 2016, 2017, so we were a little behind the curve. And then we didn't get actually like fentanyl until 2018, 2019. And I'm going to show you another graph here shortly. These are national overdose deaths, and these are, on the left is the national prescriptions for painkillers. God, I'm struggling with that.
You should have had some chicken.
I should have, that's my problem. And then on the right, it's the national overdose deaths, and those graphs are very similar, right? The curve to both of those graphs are very similar. What that doesn't show is what fentanyl has done. This graph is Bismarck, the Bismarck overdoses that my department currently tracks. And you can see we really didn't have much of a problem for sure before 2015. I was still working dope in 2015. And I did one heroin case, I think. Everything was meth back then. But then in probably 2016, 2017, stuff started happening around here as far as the it becoming more of an epidemic. What happened in 2020? Can anybody tell me? COVID happened in 2020 for sure. Let's not forget about COVID. But something happened as far as the Bismarck area. The blue graph is non-fatal overdoses, and the red graph is fatal overdoses. And you can see in about 2019, late 2018, early 2019, and certainly into 2020, that graph jumps significantly. The only reason 2022 isn't higher is because we're halfway through 2022 right now. But the numbers, it's hard to see on here with that, but we are tracking to be about the same as last year. Thank you, wonderful tech helper. So last year we had 18 fatalities, 18 fatal overdoses in Bismarck, directly related to prescription meds. And those are the ones that we can track and prove were fatal overdoses. I'm sure there's a few more that got missed by the system and got blamed on other things, but we know 18 for sure. This year we're halfway through the year and we're already at 9 again. So this graph, when I'm doing this presentation sometime next year, this graph is going to be a steady constant, I have a feeling, for a while, as long as that fentanyl is still around. We had a prescription drug problem in Bismarck before fentanyl. Fentanyl has just raised the stakes as far as overdoses, and especially deadly overdoses. And by the way, this graph is not, to those of us who work in the field, that graph is not just numbers. That graph is people who, like I personally have been dealing with my whole career. We lost one about probably a month ago that I've dealt with many times. Always liked him, was always super decent with me, we got along. He had a substance abuse problem, and it finally killed him. And there's many stories like that for any of us that work dope. So these aren't just merely numbers, these are actual people.
Is there an average age range?
No, and we'll talk about why in a little bit. Certainly younger than they should be. But there is an average age range, I just couldn't think, I can't think of what that would even be right now. So, and please, thank you. Feel free to stop me and ask questions anytime during the presentation. I do like the interaction, so otherwise it's just me up here talking, and I'm really not much of a talker. So I want to talk a little bit about the difference between opiates and opioids, because I kind of use the terms interchangeably, which I think is okay. I'm not a scientist or a doctor, so if there's any scientists or doctors out there that are going to get super hyped up about me interchanging things, and I'm sorry. Opiates, codeine, morphine, opium, heroin, they're derived from opium, directly from opium. Opioids, they include natural, synthetic, and semi-synthetic. And those are what you take home, your hydrocodones, your oxys, your hydros, and your hydromorphones and your oxymorphones. And opiates bind to specific opioid receptors in your nervous system and other tissues such as in the GI tract. You talk about people getting that constipation from opioids, because that's what they bind to in your system. They stimulate the release of dopamine, which causes euphoria, we all know that, if they're abused. And they're primarily used for pain relief and anesthesia purposes. There is no better medicine, whether natural or the synthetic, at treating pain than opiates, which is why we're in the dilemma we're in right now. They are fantastic at treating pain. It's just the consequences of that we're suffering from. They can also be used to suppress cough, suppress diarrhea, I talked about that, and then treat opioid addiction. Methadone, Suboxone, and those kind of things do help treat opioid addiction. So it's a little bit of the kind of the cancer is the cure kind of thing. They're also commonly used for their psychoactive properties. Naloxone or Narcan. Does anybody carry Narcan? Thank you for doing that. Have you ever used it? Thank you. I hope you don't either. That graph I showed you earlier about overdoses in Bismarck Mandan would be significantly, I would say tremendously higher if it wasn't for the ready availability of Narcan. A few years ago, all of our officers started carrying Narcan. We have many, many saves just with the police department alone. And I know from talking to addicts and their friends that they all carry Narcan now too. So that graph, that's the other thing with that graph in Bismarck Mandan, there are tons of these that we don't even hear about. Partially because of Narcan and partially because they don't want to call us. They don't want first responders coming to their house and oops, they left drug paraphernalia out. I'm going to talk about the Good Samaritan Law in a little bit too. But these are vastly underreported.
So is Narcan available, I mean, without a prescription? And
Yes.
what is it cost usually?
Can you repeat that question?
Oh, she asked if Narcan is readily available and what does it cost? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Poor memory. You can pick it up at any pharmacy, I think now, and I'm not even sure what it costs. My department, go ahead. Yeah.
I get mine from the Bismarck City Nursing.
Oh,
They'll give it to you.
there you go. You can get it free at Bismarck City Nursing. Cool, which is down on South 5th Street,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Thank you. Go ahead.
How would you know to use it, in a sense, like how would you know that they're overdosing?
So I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Yep. So one of the Narcan has a very high affinity to those opioid receptors that I talk about, right? You ingest I'm just gonna go with fentanyl, and it binds to the opioid receptors in your brain and your central nervous system. What Narcan does is it blocks those opioid receptors because it has a higher affinity to those receptors. So it bumps off that bad stuff and sits on those receptors so the bad stuff can't get in there. Actually, this graph is better. So it's going to be hard for you guys online to see, but the Narcan will bump those off and will then bind on those receptors and block those receptors. The problem, so we had to change our policy. When this first started happening in our community, we would get there, administer Narcan, sometimes up to 5 doses of it to bring somebody out of it. But once they came out of it, if they didn't want to go to the hospital, they could just sign a waiver with Metro, which is the ambulance service, and everybody would go on their merry way. But we got that, the people who work narcotics got that policy changed, because the problem is that Narcan will bind on here, but the half-life of some of these opiates, opioids, is longer than Narcan, which means it stays in your system longer than Narcan. So once the Narcan dissipates, the bad stuff is still up in your system, and it binds right back to those receptors, and they go right back into overdose. So now we have a policy, and Metro has a policy. If we go there for an overdose, you're going to the hospital. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Even if we have to force you, we usually don't. You're going to the hospital, and you're going to sit there, and we're going to make sure you're okay. So Narcan is wonderful, but it's not perfect.
What is that time frame of, like, how long they can then go back?
So you can see here, Narcan lasts 30 to 90 minutes. There's so much, like, if you think of the reason we have so much trouble with blood alcohol is because everybody's system is different. It's the same with opiates. Everybody's system is different. It goes by metabolism, it goes by your body weight, just how fast your body processes things. Some people are just naturally better at it than others. So there's no given time frame. Even you can see the Narcan, they give 30 to 90 minutes. Well, that's a pretty wide time frame for Narcan. So there's a lot of factors that go into that. I kind of talked about that. Numerous doses of Narcan be necessary. The most I've seen is like 5 or 6 doses to get somebody out of their overdose dilemma. So this is a case study that I personally worked. I worked a few cases, some of my favorite cases. Obviously, we all like working the big drug organizations because that's kind of why you get into narcotics. Some of my very favorite cases are when I get called by hospitals or nursing homes because they have staff stealing from patients. And this is one of those cases. The suspect, who I won't name or anything, but had a motor vehicle accident, which led to the need for long-term pain management because they had back pain, right? So they go see the doctor, and that pain management leads to a prescription for hydromorphone. The prescription was, and this wasn't an uncommon prescription history for me to see back in, this is probably like 2015 or so. That person was getting 112 hydromorphone pills per month for over 3 years. That's 4 hydromorphone pills per day for over 3 years. That's a lot of hydromorphone. If I laid it out here, we would all say that's a lot of hydromorphone, right? That is 4,032 doses of synthetic opium. So as a narcotics investigator, and frankly as a human being, when I look at that prescription and I look at somebody taking 4,032 doses of synthetic opium, how is that person not supposed to get addicted? How? It'd be impossible. If I told you to take 4,000 doses of meth, do you think you would go into that thinking, well, I won't get addicted, I'll just get a little high every once in a while? That's not how drugs work. So of course it led to an addiction for this person. The other thing with addiction and with drug abuse is that you develop a tolerance to that medication. I'm sure everybody knows what tolerance is, but my best example of tolerance is I didn't drink coffee until I became an investigator. Now as an investigator, if you don't walk around looking snooty with a coffee cup, you don't really fit in. So when I first started drinking coffee, I would drink like a cup of coffee. You know, you get that little stimulant shake thing. 13 years into being an investigator, I can't imagine how much coffee I would have to drink to get that same stimulant shaky thing, right? Most of us have experienced that. That's tolerance. And your body does the same thing with drugs. It does the same thing with alcohol, all kinds of stuff. Larger quantities are needed to gain the same effect. So the problem with tolerance and pain medication is you need more and more of that medication to get that same pain relief that you were getting at the beginning of it. So like this patient maybe started out with 2 hydromorphone per day, but by the time I got to her, she was up to 4 hydromorphones per day, probably to try to treat the same amount of pain. So that patient was then faced with, you either supplement your prescription illegally, right? Because the doctor is only going to issue you 112 hydromorphone pills per month. But if you go to the doctor and you say, hey, it's not cutting it for me anymore, what options does the doctor have? Is he going to keep upping your dose till you're taking 8 hydromorphones per day, right? I say he or she. No. They might be at risk of getting cut off from their prescription, which they're scared of because they need that pain management because they're in pain. So it's sort of it's a bad choice for somebody in that situation. So you'll find regular professionals either stealing medication or supplementing it by doing like illegal street deals for somebody else's medication, or nowadays for heroin or for fentanyl. And this is causing professionals to act out because of their addictions. You think of, I worked a hospital social worker, I worked a few nurses stealing from their patients. You don't get into those professions with the idea that you're going to hurt people. You get into those professions with the opposite idea, right? They're there to help people. And yet because of what had happened to this person, in this specific case, they're stealing from the very people that they're there to help. That to me is pretty tragic. And it's something that I titled this presentation, It Could Happen to You, because it really could. There's cops in this same situation that have a need for pain medication. Somehow it develops into an addiction, and then they don't know what to do, and then bad things are happening. So they steal our prescription medications, or they do the street level drug deals. Go ahead.
Can I go back to the Narcan?
Yes.
This will be me, because I really don't know. When you say overdose, do you mean overdose dead or overdose passed out?
Both.
And Narcan can bring them back from being dead?
No, not from death. No.
Okay.
No.
That's what I was, what I think people believe.
Yeah, Narcan is not gonna bring you back from death, it's gonna bring you back from near death.
Okay.
But if you're in that overdose state too long, you are gonna die, which is basically what most of our.
Okay. Because there is a theory out there that Narcan is bringing them back.
Let me debunk the theory, and for those of you online who couldn't hear the question, let me debunk the theory that Narcan will bring you back from death. It will not. It will not.
That's a close call, guys.
For those online, we had a food spillage situation. It's handled.
Food save, I think she saved it.
Because, I've been in narcotics long enough now where I can see patterns and trends. And we never had a heroin problem. I talked about it a little bit at the beginning. We never had a heroin problem. Now we have a fire alarm problem here. Heroin acts on the same cell receptors and can be substituted for those opioids. And it's sometimes cheaper or more readily accessible to addicts than the prescription pain medications that they were buying illegally to supplement their addictions. I'll give you, for example, heroin is $10 to $20 per point. And what a point is a tenth of a gram. And that's how much heroin people take for one dosage, is a tenth of a gram. A gram is a sugar packet. Do you think of a little sugar packet? That is a gram of sugar. That'd be roughly the same as a gram of heroin. So a tenth of that sugar packet is going to be a dosage unit of heroin. And that's $10 to $20 per point in larger cities. When we first started getting heroin into Bismarck, it was about $100 a point. So $1,000 a gram for heroin. Now we're down to, I think, $30 or $40 per point. That is because the demand is meeting the supply and then some. It's just like any other business, like a used car lot, right? Either you have lots of inventory or you have lots of cash or somewhere in between. And usually it'll swing in the drug world, it swings to where either there's too much supply or too much demand. And that's why the prices are going down. That's also how I know we're losing. We're losing because those prices are going down so significantly. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. And with the pills, like the blues that we're seeing right now, which are the biggest #1 problem, the M30 pills, that is the #1 thing we are seizing off the streets right now. We're down to, those pills started out $70, $80 per pill locally here. Now they're down to $30 to $40 per pill. And they're basically counterfeit oxycodone, except they're not oxycodone, they're almost all fentanyl now. And almost like 100% pure fentanyl now, which is something, the newest trend in this pill thing.
So how many pills does it take for somebody to overdose?
One. You could potentially, like, I'm assuming those of us in the room, let's just take myself, for example, that's safe. One pill maybe caused me to overdose because I haven't built a tolerance. I have no kind of, I try not to take prescription medications, so one pill taken wrongly, and I'll explain that, not as prescribed, could be fatal for me. So these are very, especially because these M30s you buy off the street, they're not oxycodone, they are fentanyl. They're gonna be fentanyl.
Are we seeing more that they're shooting this up?
We are seeing them mostly, right now, probably mostly inhaling, and then intravenously would probably be the second most abused way.
So to inhale, would that be crush them and put them in a pipe or?
I will explain how we can all inhale pills. Just kidding. So why is heroin and the opiates, why is it so hard to kick? With any kind of addictive substance, whether it's cigarettes, alcohol, coffee, any kind of addictive substance, you're gonna have a mental addiction to it, right? And we all kind of understand mental addiction, how you just crave it, you crave it. Heroin to me has the worst physical addiction attributes of any of these substances, and which makes it really, really difficult to kick. Think about it this way. A heroin addict cannot physically function without their daily fix. So every 12 to 24 hours, they're either shooting up or snorting some sort of opiate, whether it's a pill or actual heroin or fentanyl, every 12 to 24 hours. The best way I've had it explained to me, they will tell you, and I'm a member of the drug court board here in Bismarck also, and when you talk to people struggling with substance use disorder, they will tell you if they don't get their fix every 12 to 24 hours. Who here's had the flu? Everybody had the flu? It was just a wonderful experience, right? How long was that for you? 12 hours of misery? 24? Maybe 48 if you're super unlucky? Think of the worst flu you've ever had in your life, and think of having that for 7 to 10 days. That's what the physical withdrawals are like for people who are addicted to these substances. That's why it's so hard to kick. It'd be far easier if it were not. I don't want to minimize the mental aspect, but when you think about knowing you're going to get sick if you don't get their fix, of course they're going to act out. Of course they're going to act out. So why do we have an epidemic? Most current heroin and fentanyl users started with prescription pain medication, like the example I showed you earlier. Since 1999, 932,000 people in the US have died from overdose, died. World War II, what did we lose, like 450,000? Something like that? So like twice as many as we lost in World War II. Since '99, we've lost from this epidemic. The other thing I can think is even maybe will rival this will be COVID by the time we're done with it, hopefully sometime soon. Opioid abuse costs the US $740 billion per year, and that's because of lost productivity, healthcare, criminal justice costs, and things like that. Think about it. When you guys had the flu, did you go to work that day? No, right? Thank you for not going to work that day from your coworkers. So they can't work, they can't take care of their kids. Maybe that's why some of you are foster parents right now, because you're dealing with kids who are a product of parents who are struggling with this issue. So to get into heroin indicators, somebody asked earlier, you're looking at droopy eyelids, drowsiness, dry mouth or bruxism. One thing we look for in narcotics is somebody who is licking their lips and kind of smack, that lip smacking thing, that kind of thing. It's because they get dry mouth. Meth does this too, actually, so it's kind of an indicator for more than one substance. They're going to have track marks. I know of an addict who I've dealt with probably my whole career in narcotics in town here, who I saw at the hospital or in the courthouse a few years ago. I was just coming out of the courtroom and she was in the courthouse. Didn't ask her for what. I've always liked her. We've always got along, so didn't care. It's just good to see her. She was 7 months pregnant and had track marks all up and down both arms. 7 months pregnant. They eventually will run out of places to shoot up, to where they're shooting up in the neck or other areas that you don't even want to think about them shooting up. Constricted pupils, the difference between these substances and methamphetamine is somebody actively high on methamphetamine is going to have big, huge dishpan pupils, like noticeable, like holy cow. When you're on these substances, you're going to have very, very constricted, tiny, tiny pinpoint pupils. You have to be careful with that because sometimes people who have strokes will have either large or smaller pupils, but usually their pupils are different, which is a teller too. If your pupils are different sizes because of substances, they're going to be the same. Both pupils are going to be the same. So with this heroin, you're going to have those tiny, tiny pinpoint constricted pupils. And you're going to be what we call on the nod. It almost looks like the worst, most heavily intoxicated person you ever saw in your life, where they can hardly keep their eyes open. When you walk downtown in the bigger cities and you see people basically falling asleep on their feet, they're on the nod, and it's probably heroin or opiates. Could be alcohol too, but there's other ways you can tell if it's alcohol. When we're talking about paraphernalia for these substances, just about any single way you can think of getting into their body, they will do it. I talked earlier about the most common around here right now is to snort the pills or to shoot them up. When you, anybody know what that is on the spoon? Good. Glad you guys don't know it. So when you come home with a prescription for, let's take oxycodone, for example. You take it as prescribed, right? Once or twice a day, take it as prescribed. There are built-in safety measures in that pill when you take it like you're supposed to where you get there's a coating on it, to where it breaks down slowly in your body, in your stomach, and then it absorbs it, and you get the wonderful pain relief without the high. Basically, when they're breaking these pills down and they're snorting them or injecting them, they are getting around that time release, and they're getting at the high, is what they're getting. So this cotton swab, do you guys want to know how to shoot up pills, or is that even appropriate? No, you don't. Should I? No. The cotton swab is so they don't get pill chunks in their veins, because nobody wants pill chunks floating around in their veins. It kind of acts as a filter in the spoon. But these spoons, as far as paraphernalia, you're going to see burn marks on them because they're basically melting those pills down in a little bit of water. Again, to get around that time release and to get it into their system. When they're snorting pills, they're just snorting it across tin foil. And the different methods of injection, some are faster acting, some produce more powerful highs. It's kind of a personal preference thing. But the thing around here right now is they're snorting them off tin foil. So the effects in the Bismarck Mandan area, I've already talked about the non-fatal and fatal overdoses. My chief said the other day if we had 18 homicides in Bismarck, he'd be out of a job, right? The public would be in an outcry, we'd have to do something about it, right? We had 18 overdoses, fatal overdoses last year, and hundreds of non-fatal. And it's almost like it's not happening, unless you're actually on the street and in the field. The ERs, they certainly know about it. Addiction counselors, they know about it. But you can be a normal citizen and have a great job in Bismarck and not even really know about this stuff right now. It's kind of sad. It's also brought an influx of inner city gang members, specifically from the Detroit area. Some from Chicago, but from the Detroit area. Problem with that is there is a level of violence in town here now with this crowd that we have never seen before. I kind of cut my teeth in narcotics working meth cases. And yes, there was some violence involved with that too, but nowhere near the level of extreme indifference that we're seeing with these guys from Detroit. They're bringing their violence, they're bringing their human trafficking, and they're bringing sack pimping, which is, if you think about it, if you're a vulnerable woman who is addicted to heroin, how are you gonna afford that habit, right? What are you gonna sell? You're gonna sell drugs for your boyfriend, and eventually you're gonna sell your bodies. Same thing. As far as the violence, the last two, every time I say the H word, I have to knock on wood. The last two homicides we've had in town here, one was an attempted and one was a actual homicide. They look like absolute war zones. You're talking like automatic rifles in apartment buildings. There's some innocent person on the other side of that wall in danger of taking rounds from these guys. They just do not hesitate. There's no thought process between them and the actual use of violence. It's more than kind of scary, it is scary. We're seeing an increase in IV drug use, which means we're finding needles all over the place. We get calls from the public daily to dispose of drug paraphernalia. That's not uncommon anymore. And then starting in like 2014, 2015, we started to take a huge look at our lack of treatment facilities here in the area. And we've gotten a lot better. We're getting better, but we still have a long ways to go. And like I said before, all officers now carry Narcan, and we have numerous saves just with the PD alone. I can't imagine what Metro, and if you throw fire in there, I'm sure they have saves too. Those are the ones we're hearing about. So what are we doing? We have methadone treatment now available. It may surprise some people to know that most narcotics investigators were for the methadone treatment. We had to do something different. This is not a problem we're going to arrest our way out of. I was a part of those early boards where they were trying to decide on bringing the methadone treatment in, and some of the less informed administrators, I would say, didn't understand the problem, and they sort of looked at it like, if you build it, they will come. There was that mentality, whereas the guys on the street were saying it's already here. You might as well do something about it. And when it's run right, it's I always use Heartview. They're kind of the gold standard around here for treatment. They really do run a good methadone program, I think, personal opinion. We are now, law enforcement and prosecutors are targeting dealers. We are spending far less time. When I first got into narcotics, we did a lot of street level drug deals that didn't really go anywhere. When you hear we're not going to arrest our way out of the problem, that was part of the problem. That's what we were doing. We spend most of our time targeting organizations and the higher ups in those organizations, which are all from out of state. It's all coming from out of state. Talked about that. And we are also educating the criminal justice system, because this is something that, until you're actually there seeing it, like judges, you don't really understand the scope of the problem. And education for the public, because like I said, if we had 18 homicides in Bismarck here last year, the police department would be out of a job, because we're not doing very well here. So as far as local treatment, the problems, if you think about, I always look at it, I'm part of the human trafficking task force too, and it's the same, they have the same needs, those victims. They need immediate admission into healthcare services. A lot of times they need housing. They certainly need mental health help. Is there any place in America you can get that immediately? We're really bad about it, right? I'm not sure if we're any worse than any other place, but we're pretty bad about, right? How long do you have to sit to wait in line, let alone for long-term mental health care? You're talking weeks and months in advance. This is a problem we run into I'm on the drug court board. We run into this in drug court all the time. How soon can we get them started in Heartview? And trying to keep somebody who's been charged with a drug crime and who's out in the public. So either we throw them in jail in like the interim 2 weeks until we can get them into some sort of inpatient treatment, or at least into BTC for housing. Trying to keep them on the rails for that 2 weeks is just about impossible. They're gonna abscond, because for these, they have to have their daily fix, right? And they can't do that in BTC, and they can't do that in the F5 house or any of those other housing things that we use, or centers that we use. Money's also a problem. A lot of these people don't have insurance. If you have insurance, you can get treatment. It's gonna get paid for. But if you don't have insurance, you're on the struggle bus as far as affording some of this stuff. One of the big things we're looking at in drug court right now is our lack of aftercare options. We are finding drug court, to get successfully through drug court, you used to be able to do it in a little over a year. Means you had to be not perfect, but good for a year to get through the program. Now we're finding we've extended it. It usually takes like 14, 15 months now to get through the program, and we're finding that's not even long enough because people are getting out and they're using again. And that speaks to the power of fentanyl and heroin. It's just a tougher kick than anything we've experienced. So we are looking at better aftercare options for our drug court participants and for anybody struggling with substance abuse, because that's never gonna go away. It's gonna dim hopefully, but it's never gonna go away. The need and the urge and the longing for it. The other problem, and I'm gonna get a little soapboxy here, but we have a lack of state accountability. We really do. I talked about those shootings that look like war zones. One of them was an attempted murder. Guy got shot in the mouth and lived. But instead of charging it as a attempted homicide in state, we took the charge federal on a gun charge. He wasn't supposed to have a gun, because we know he'll get more time federally on a gun charge than he will in the state on an attempted homicide charge. So we have swung, my personal opinion, we've swung a little too far. You know, you don't want draconian measures, but again, you're not going to arrest your way out of the problem either, right? So we seem to struggle with putting that pendulum in the middle, like where it should be, because everybody's where it should be is a little bit different. But right now, I think we've swung a little too much toward letting everybody out and no accountability. And that's not just me saying that. I listen to judges all the time talk about it's gone too far. But we have really good judges in town here. We really do. I worked with them for years. I don't always agree with their rulings, but I also understand that is a tough, tough job. And when one of our judges sentences somebody to 10 years, they should probably do close to 10 years, barring some unforeseen circumstances. Right now, since they did away with mandatory minimums, since they did away with any sort of truth in sentencing, you can get a 10-year sentence in North Dakota here, and you're probably going to be out in less than 4. And some of these are very dangerous individuals, and we're not doing a lot as far as getting them whatever help they need in prison to make sure they don't do this again. It's a tough thing for society, because either we pay for it in jail, right, after they've already done it, or we have these social services programs or great foster parents, somebody who can take care of it on the front end, right, to keep this from ever happening. We're just trying to find that middle ground, and I'm sure all societies across the world are struggling with the same thing. This is the way we do it. These are the weaknesses in our system. I've never been to a place where they didn't have homelessness and poverty and generational trauma. So we're just not, I think we're getting better at it, but we're not great as a human race about overcoming that stuff. So specifically, what can you guys do? Does anybody here know attachment theory? Anybody psych major kind of attachment? You probably know more than I do. But here's what I tell people attachment theory is. Hug your kids. Rock your babies, sing to your babies, hug your kids. When I was a criminal justice major in college, and we go over all these theories on why people become criminals or why they get addicted to stuff. To me, I have almost 20 years of law enforcement experience now. The one that best explains societal problems and people's individual psychology is attachment theory, because they're trying to find that love and belonging that they never got as kids. So hug your kids. Right now they're like, ugh. Because it has to do not just, there's a physical connection there too, but it is so crucial to their emotional development to have that love and belonging. Most of the addicts that I talk to, by far, the vast majority of human trafficking victims that I talk to, that's what they're looking for. They're looking for that love and belonging that they did not get as kids. Usually it's even worse than just not getting it. If you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I'm big on Maslow's hierarchy. I use it as a supervisor because I'm always trying to figure out what is he trying to get at here? We're all trying to get at something in our lives, right? Hopefully, if you have all these other needs met, you're somewhere working on your self-actualization, which is being the best person you can possibly be, right? It's way oversimplified. So if there's any psychologists out there, I apologize. But one of the things that I think is interesting about Maslow and would be what you guys are looking for as foster parents. Right now on the Human Trafficking Task Force, the biggest thing that we're working on is underage girls being trafficked. And that is in North Dakota, and that's the biggest thing we're working on right now. You think it doesn't happen here? I'm here to tell you it happens here a lot. So when we're dealing with runaway kids, and I say girls because it's a majority of them, there's boys out there too that are experiencing the same things. They have their psychological needs met, or physiological needs met. They're breathing, they have food, they have water, shelter, clothing, sleep. Even bad families in America, for the most part, can provide that stuff, right? Everybody gets that in America, for the most part. Safety and security, their health, their employment, property, family, and social stability. That's kind of iffy with some of these kids, but for the most part, they have their safety and security, and they have their physiological needs met. But they're still running away. And they're running away because they are not getting love and belonging, friendship, family, intimacy, and a sense of connection. Because they're growing up in poverty and mostly in trauma. They're growing up with physical abuse, with sexual abuse, which is why you guys are so important. I cannot tell you how important you guys are within our system. And when I say our system, I'm talking about especially the Human Trafficking Task Force, because I hear the service provider side of things struggle with where to put these girls and boys, but where to put these girls. We are working on, next legislature, the Human Trafficking Task Force is going to try to get funding to put up a shelter specifically for victims of human trafficking. You can't just put them in any normal kid shelter because, shocker, they are not just any normal kid who had a few family problems and ran away from home. They're physically abused. The vast majority of them have been sexually abused, which is where it all starts. So I can't tell you how much we appreciate you guys doing what you do, especially on behalf of the Human Trafficking Task Force. What I would tell you, and this is something that's changed in law enforcement, we talk about a victim-centered approach to our investigations. My department is all about that. And what that means is we engage with these, and I'm talking about the kid victims. We engage with them. It's not just about sitting down and interviewing them. Where did this happen at? Some dry interview where you have no interaction, right? We actually try to build relationships with these kids through engagement because they're not going to tell me anything otherwise, right? Think of all the barriers that I have to overcome to talk to a 14-year-old girl who ran away because she's been sexually abused at home and now she's being trafficked out on the street because she's become drug addicted. She's got two things to sell, right? Drugs or herself. So think of the barriers that I have as an older white male cop to try to get this kid to tell me what's going on in the street. You're not going to do that with one hour interview. You're not. So we send people in there, we send investigators in there to specifically engage with these kids in the hope that somewhere down the line, they'd be willing to talk to us and tell us what happened to them. That's the only way to do it. And where I appreciate our service provider partners like the Dakota Children's Advocacy Center, Youth Works, Social Services, all our service provider partners, they are really good at establishing relationships with these kids. And they can help us establish those relationships too. We're all sort of moving toward the same goal. And it's a better team approach, and I really like our victim-centered investigations and victim-centered prosecution. So, go ahead.
Just wondering statistically, how many of the younger girls and boys get trafficked, you say it in?
So she asked me that again.
Statistically, about how many boys and girls, mostly girls, get trafficked in North Dakota alone?
She asked how many statistically boys and girls get trafficked in North Dakota. Like if you look at the overall population, it's gonna be a low percentage, right? Because most of us have a decent family structure. But there are, you can almost see it, there's certain factors to where certain populations in North Dakota are very much more vulnerable to being trafficked. I couldn't tell you any statistics, but it all has to do with that generational poverty and trauma. Like, we go to houses where families don't know how to communicate without yelling at each other. And as someone who didn't grow up that way and certainly didn't raise our kids that way, it's just wrong to me, but that's all these kids know, that's all their parents have known, that's all their grandparents have known. It's that generational thing that we're just trying to combat, and that's a huge indicator for us. And then sexual abuse. And if I could get a little soapboxy, kids nowadays, so we have seen a huge rise in drug crimes since I started. We've also seen a huge rise in sex-related crimes. And the only thing I can think of is when I was growing up, probably my generation and older, we didn't have cell phones, right? We couldn't look at porn 24 hours. We didn't have access to porn 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Nowadays, unless you're there standing over your kid's shoulder every single minute, they have access to this stuff. So it's not like I want to outlaw porn or I'm some sort of prude or anything, but you have to look at the consequences to society for some of the things that were happening. And the only thing I can think of with all these, with this increase in incest and sex crimes, and it's like things I never thought I'd have to deal with as an investigator. That's the only common link I can see. Go ahead.
So we have some teenage girls
We
in the
do.
room. And I know from my household, sometimes they don't think that it's dangerous chatting with somebody online. They have no clue who they are. They
Right.
just think they're cute. The guy shows a picture of his muscles and they think, oh, he's wonderful. Fall in love on the internet. Don't know who this guy is, where he's from, nothing. And yet it's harmless.
Right.
It's harmless till the guy shows up wherever
Right.
she's at because he's tracking her.
And I'm not even I think we're not perfect as a society with preventing like that Stranger Thing where they meet up online and they come and get these girls. I'm talking about just the effects. So your brain is still forming till age 25, something like that, right? So the effects of, because porn is a stimulant, you're essentially, it's a release of dopamine, right? So you're giving your kid, when they're looking at this, you might as well just give them a shot of meth because of the dopamine it releases. I got really sidetracked here without even, I don't know where this came from, but it's all interrelated. Just try to follow me. Anyway, you are overstimulating young developing minds, and that's not good for anybody. We didn't have, most of us in this room didn't have that growing up.
I know I went to a presentation and it was on sex trafficking. And the woman who put it on had been sex trafficked. She was in it for years.
Good here.
And she was starting a place in Williston.
Okay.
And was taking in girls and stuff and trying to find them on the streets and was looking for help and whatnot. And that was one of the things she talked about, though, was how the internet has played a big part in it. And the truck stops and, you know, just those types of things where you wouldn't, I stepped out of a truck driver, I never would have dreamt,
Right.
you know,
He didn't tell you either.
well, I don't, no,
That existed back then, it just existed in a different form, and it's just so much more readily available now that,
right,
and I'm not saying, I don't have any fixes for it, I'm just saying we need to look at the consequences of it as a society. Because you know, you're mixing in free speech and a person's right to do what they want. I get that, but there's cost to that as a society, so. The biggest thing I want to tell you guys, and this comes from me dealing with these young runaway kids that they're just kind of, we'll go pick them up, we'll engage with them, 2 days later they're gone again. Maintain, as foster parents, please maintain realistic expectations. You probably are not just a whistle stop, but you're a whistle stop in this kid's life. And you can't undo the years or decades of trauma, drug use, physical and sexual abuse, etc., that these kids have experienced, right? So I go through the same thing as an investigator. I will go and there's kids that we've had our success stories are through engagement. We've had kids that call the investigator that they are connected with and tell them what's going on, even though they're still on the run. They know if we find them, we have to pick them up and take them to wherever we're going to take them. But they will call that investigator just for that engagement. You guys can do that too. You can be the bright spot in this kid's otherwise pretty horrible life, right? So that's my advice to you as foster parents. And we're hopefully all this ties in together. I do want to end on our Safe Streets Law, our Good Samaritan Law. One of the problems we have, it happens everywhere, is that nobody wants to call us if somebody's overdosing, right? They don't understand, they think we're going there and hoping to arrest somebody. We're going there to save a life. I don't care if I ever make another arrest again my whole career. Now that I'm an administrator, I probably won't. But I want to make sure everybody understands we do have a Good Samaritan Law here in North Dakota. Basically, no person who renders aid or assistance necessary, blah, 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 may be criminally charged in this state. And I'm here to tell you, my guys honor this, not just by the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law also. And we err on the side of caution. I have literally many times collected drugs and drug paraphernalia from a scene and walked away and put it into evidence, and nobody got charged because they did the right thing and they called 911. We still, even though we preach this all the time, we still go to overdoses to where we get there and nobody's around because everybody's scared. We have nothing to be scared of. Nobody's going to get arrested. We're going to ask you questions because we need to know what they took. But we do honor this. And I just wanted to kind of end on that, so spread that around if you will, if you have the opportunity. I'm out of time. Are there any other questions?
On the average, like say in a month, how often are you able to arrest somebody or rescue somebody from human trafficking in Bismarck? I'm sure it's very
So complicated, because human trafficking, it doesn't look like they used to call them lot lizards. I hate that term, but it doesn't look like that anymore. It doesn't look like women walking down Main Street, the car pulls up and they get in the window and say, how much for this and whatever. Human trafficking in Bismarck looks like people up on, it's not Backpage anymore, but on those websites, and then you call the number and you make arrangements and you go to the hotel. So we do John's things, right? It looks like these underage girls that are being trafficked. That's what we spend the vast majority of our time working on. And it also looks like, we just had another one last week or the week before, it looks like spas doing sex acts for money. So that's what human trafficking looks like in Bismarck. And unfortunately, just like working with the underage victims, our success comes in getting those people out of that situation. It doesn't necessarily come in making arrests or getting a criminal conviction on it, because the main barrier in work, and I worked out for so many years and didn't even realize it, the main barrier to prosecution, to successful prosecution in personal crimes is the victim. Because in America, as it should be, the person who's accused gets to confront the person that's accusing them. So you think of, take a 15-year-old girl who's been trafficked by an adult male. If it comes down to it, she's gonna have to get on the stand and testify about what he did to her. And I guarantee you, because I've seen it, they play so many games. They will fire their attorneys so they can directly cross-examine that victim. So if you're a 15-year-old, if you're an adult woman, that's a horrible experience, right? Most of us as human beings don't have that kind of fortitude. We just want it to be over with, which is why the personal crimes thing is so tough, so tough. I always tell guys, I had it so easy in dope. You found meth in his pocket, you arrest him. Personal crimes is a whole nother thing. And where I was leading to is our success there comes in the engagement. With the spa cases that we've had, we got convictions. It wasn't like the big trafficking charges that we wanted, but we got those women out of that situation. Just like we're getting those little runaway girls off the street for a night or two, and we're engaging with them. Just like you guys, you can be that bright spot in their lives for a few days, a few months, even a few years that they won't forget, because they don't have that from anybody else. So that's what we're trying to be, and I hope that's what you guys are trying to be too.
Are there any online questions?
Yeah, there's more of a comment, but I'm gonna turn it into a question. So we had a gal say, she had a comment about the Good Samaritan Law and that she was in a situation that she thought she was gonna get in trouble, so she was just scared and didn't call for help when she should have. And so she's kind of wondering like why you guys wouldn't have like documentation or something to flash so people in the area know like you're not going to get arrested, or is there anything you guys try to do if there's people in the area to be like, you're not in trouble?
Here's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get up and put up the Good Samaritan Law every time I give one of these speeches, because we still, no matter how many presentations I do, we still, every single day we go to an overdose where people have fled.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they have warrants because of the lifestyle and things like that. But a lot of times there would be, we couldn't even arrest them if we wanted to because of the Good Samaritan Law. So I don't know, there's no, other than not having cops go to that at all, but we're usually the first ones there because we're out on the street. We almost always beat fire to a fire. We almost always beat the ambulance to a medical call because we're already out there driving around. So there's just no, other than to preach the Good Samaritan Law as much as we can, there's no early warning.
Do you guys have to do like any dialogue when you get to the scene, like, hey, as part of this Good Samaritan Law, please don't flee?
Usually we're more worried about what happened
Yeah.
than, because I mean, if they're still there, they're gonna stick. If they're there when we get there, they generally stick around. So, but if that person, if you at least called 911, that's better than nothing. So thank you for that. Yeah.
A comment I was gonna make too was the, which Mike is a part of it, but the North Dakota Human Trafficking Task Force, they do have a website that has a lot of great resources and a lot of the North Dakota statistics for you to see how many victims they've served and cases they've been a part of and things like that too.
So since I became an administrator, my job became far less rewarding. I would say I took a demotion to management, but the The rewarding things in my job are the human trafficking task force. I love that team, and drug court. Absolutely love my drug court team. We're making a difference. It's not every time, but we're making a difference. So
Are there hotels or motels that are more active with that kind of stuff? Like I've heard Motel 6 and Bismarck Hotel are supposed to be
yep,
the most active.
there are a couple bad ones, but I can tell you it can happen in any motel because those victims, they don't like staying at Motel 6. Or, I mean, no offense to, let me just use the budget in because I don't feel bad about that one. They don't like staying at those places. Would they rather stay there or at one of the I don't want to pick on a nice hotel.
Right.
Of course they'd rather stay in a nice hotel. And they're making enough money, it's just whether their trafficker allows them to spend that money. Plus, if you think of it as a business model, it's a better business model. This sounds terrible, but just looking at it as a business model, would you rather have the customers at which hotel? I guess that's a terrible way to put that. And I never thought of it that way before, but as a business model, you're probably gonna get more money and that kind of thing. And it's probably safer. I'm not condoning any of that. And I feel terrible saying that, but that's just kind of how life works, so.
Do you see less overdose called in because Narcan is available and people have it on hand?
Oh, I'm sure we do. There's no question. Yeah, I'm sure we do. Yeah. In fact, I know because I've heard people say, yeah, I've overdosed 4 times. And I'll go back and look and they're in our log like once. So I know for a fact that happens. Yeah. Yes.
Where would the most overdoses hotspots in Bismarck would be? General area?
I don't think we have any hotspots for overdoses. Because if you look at what got us here, it could be anybody. So, I mean, there's rich people struggling with this problem too. They maybe even call us less than normal people do.
I think what she's getting at is like, say, the parks, because you find a lot of needles and stuff in the parks lately.
Yeah, mostly it's in people's houses. It's not necessarily in the parks. You know, the parks crowd, that's gonna mostly be about alcohol. That certain homeless crowd that we have in Bismarck here, that's mostly about alcohol. So, anything else? She listened, she's rocking that baby. You didn't know it, you probably didn't know it. That's attachment theory. That's attachment theory. That baby's brain is just developing. It's pretty awesome. Thank you guys for what you do. Thanks for having me and keep on keeping on.
Thank you.